In this lesson, we're going to cover two more fallacies that are lookalikes. They're often confused. So I'll describe each fallacy, and then I'll attempt to describe how to discern which one is which. Okay? All right, so here are two more famous twins, the two that we need to get to know. One is misplaced or misplacing the burden of proof, and the other is called begging the question. Now, this phrase, begging the question, I want to stop and talk about that for a second, because that phrase is misused or used, not misused necessarily, but it's used in a different way in our society as a whole than it is for the purposes of this class. So a lot of times if we are out and someone says, you know, gosh, I'm really hungry, and someone else might say, well, that begs the question, what's for dinner? And what they mean when they talk about begging the question in that instance really is that the one topic sort of draws us to another issue, that it leads to another question, or it really just leads to another question, that begs the question, or it leads to this question. That's not the sense of begging the question that we are interested in this section, in fallacies. It's not what we mean when we talk about the fallacy of begging the question. So I'll get more specific with it in a couple slides. I just want you to be clear that we're not talking about begging the question in the way that we normally talk about it in everyday language, okay? All right, now first let's talk about misplacing the burden of proof. This fallacy is one that happens when we attempt to make others support or prove a point by trying to disprove it. So I know that sounds a little bit weird, but let me put it to you this way. If I make an assertion, whose responsibility is it? Who has the burden of proving that proposition? Well, I do, because I made the assertion, right? If I assert that God exists, I have the burden of proving that God exists. The burden of proof rests with me. I should have a reason for believing that. And if I can't articulate a reason for believing that, then maybe I ought not to believe it. Okay? It's sort of arbitrary. At least it shouldn't be a good reason for others to believe it just because I believe it. So misplaced burden of proof happens when the person who should be proving it, the point, puts it on others to prove that they're wrong. Puts it on others to prove not their point. So I say God exists, and you say, well, why should I think that? And I say, well, prove that God doesn't exist. Well, that's not the point, right? Why should you have the burden of making the argument? Why should you have the burden of proving anything? I'm the one who made the assertion, right? So here's the example, and it's sort of up on the slide already. You've probably already been reading it, but obviously the president's birth certificate is a forgery. Now, the person saying this is making an assertion that the president's birth certificate is a fake, okay? Now, why should we believe that? Well, because you can't prove that it isn't. Now, this is true. I can't prove that it isn't a forgery. I also can't prove that it is a forgery. I can't prove either way. I have no damn access to it. So the fact that I can't prove it doesn't make your claim true, that it is. Does that make sense? Everybody following me here? Notice that the burden of proof shifts. And I make the assertion, but I put the burden of proof on you. Well, no, that's not the way it should work. When that fallacy occurs, we call it the misplaced burden of proof. If I assert that it's very easy to win the war on Iraq, I have the burden of proving that. I can't then say, well, you can't prove that it isn't. Well, that's not the point. You said that it is, so you have to prove your point. Okay. All right. Sorry, I think I'm just beating a dead horse there. Here's another example. Can I prove the biblical flood really happened? Hey, you can't prove it didn't. Well, yes, perhaps they cannot prove that it didn't, but that they can't prove that it didn't happen doesn't justify you in believing that it did, or anyone else in believing that it did. their ability or inability to prove anything is irrelevant to whether that assertion is true, right? And what you're doing is you're placing the burden of proving, of supporting the claim you're making on them by them having to prove that you're wrong. Well, no, that's not the way it works. If you make an assertion, you have to prove that you're right. It's not up to others to prove that you're wrong. We call that the misplaced burden of proof. This next one, this appeal to ignorance, is a version or a variety of the misplaced burden of proof. This happens when it's argued that we should believe a claim is true because nobody has proved it's false. Hey, nobody's proven there's no life on Mars, so we should believe there's life on Mars. Nobody's proven that there's life on other planets, so we should not believe that there's life on other planets. Both of these are appeals to ignorance, and what we're saying is that you should accept each claim as true because nobody's been able to prove the contrary. Well, that nobody's been able to prove the contrary is an appeal to ignorance here, okay? That nobody's proven it false doesn't mean squat, okay? All right, second fallacy here is begging the question. I told you to be aware of this one that has a different meaning. This fallacy occurs when a speaker or writer tries to support or demonstrate a contention. How? By offering as quote-unquote evidence or proof what amounts to a repackaging of the very content in question. In other words, another way of thinking about begging the question is that it's a circular argument. In other words, I want you to believe my conclusion is true. And part of the reasons I give you for believing that, or the reason I give you for believing that, is something that is really just a restatement of my conclusion. It's like saying, God exists. Why do you believe that? Because Jesus lives. So Jesus lives, so God exists. Unfortunately, that's circular because Jesus is God. So when I say Jesus lives, I'm just saying God lives. And so I'm asserting that God lives, God exists because God exists. Now I'm in a circle, right? I'm begging the question. My evidence is really just a repackaging of my conclusion, okay? Here's another example. Obviously, the president told the truth about Benghazi. He wouldn't lie to us. Well, why do they think he told the truth? They think he told the truth because he wouldn't lie. But isn't he told the truth and he wouldn't lie essentially saying the same thing? Notice that the evidence or the proof they have here is just he wouldn't lie. Well, then he obviously told the truth. It's just saying the same thing in a different way. Okay? Here's another example. Can I prove the biblical flood really happened? Of course it did. Why else did Noah build the ark? Now notice, I want you to believe that the biblical flood happened. Why? Well, because Noah built the ark. Well, wait a minute. That Noah built the ark assumes the truth that the biblical flood happened. Doesn't it? Right? So, if my reason for believing the conclusion already assumes the truth of the conclusion, then it's begging the question. Let me say that again. I want you to be very careful. If the reason why I give you to believe my conclusion already assumes the truth of the conclusion, then I beg the question. I want you to believe that the biblical flood really happened, but the reason I give you for accepting that is because Noah built an ark. Small word, big boat. That's what's funny about an ark. Why else would Noah build the ark? I'm basically saying, hey, Noah built an ark. Well, wait a minute. That you only accept that Noah built an ark if you accept that there's a biblical flood. The one obviously, naturally, is just assumes the truth of the other. So then we have an instance of begging the question. All right? Okay. That's it for that lesson.